A very warm welcome to you all. This is the second of our Thinking About webinars. We're very pleased to be able to see colleagues with us on Zoom, and in about 6 seconds time, those who are joining us from the wider world of YouTube, because they're on a slight delay. So we're really excited about the opportunity to be able to reach out in this way, and very much hope that you get as much as we would like for you to be able to take from this. We recognise, of course, that your heads, just like ours, will be spinning at the moment with plans and logistics and practical challenges of the response to the government announcement over the last few days. Today, however, we're really keen that we focus on the what we really need to do in the next part of our journey, rather than the how, and that's something that we're going to focus particularly on next week. We're delighted to be able to welcome Professor Barry Carpenter to lead us through our thinking about loss, recovery, and how to connect with and address the really challenging psychological impact of the current pandemic on our children. Professor Carpenter's career has been varied and ranging in education, and specifically in special education, and his writing and ideas are internationally recognised and acclaimed. So we feel very privileged and honoured that he's able to join us and work with us today. Thank you very much for joining us. It's really good to see you again. We sincerely hope that this provides you with some good next steps thinking. And so without further ado, I'm really pleased to be able to hand over to Professor Carpenter. So over to you, Professor Carpenter.
So I want to focus on a piece that you'll have been sent, which is around the recovery curriculum, which is a concept, well, a construct, and I'm quite deliberate about the use of that word. I'll come back to why. And this actually evolved from a series of conversations between my son and I. My son Matthew is the principal at Baxter College School in Kidderminster. And he sort of twisted my arm that we really ought to write this down. I have to give you the general context that I was planning to retire at the end of June. That's now not happening for reasons I'm sure you'll begin to understand. The world has opened up in ways that I never dreamt, and I'm having conversations with people I didn't even know existed. But as a Methodist by background, by training at Westminster College, and by teaching at the college when it was still in existence, and now back there part-time as Professor for Mental Health in Education, my roots are very strongly Methodist, and it's a delight to be speaking to this group of Methodist and nonconformist schools. What we really want to consider is what it's going to be like for the children. What's loss and life for them going to be post-pandemic? And we're not really post-pandemic. We're talking of returning to school during a phase of the pandemic when there's been a mass community trauma, when there's been a public health emergency, when there's been a financial catastrophe. And we talk a lot about how resilient our children are, which many of them are, but it's actually children who will feel trauma hardest, whether that's due to developmental issues, whether they're cognitively not mature enough to comprehend certain issues that they're hearing about on a daily basis, such as the death toll or the crises in the NHS and the work of our hospitals. So we need to really think about children's trauma, because we must not assume anything. And we need to really have a focus as we're thinking about how to make our classrooms safe, how to make our social distancing work in the school environment. Start to think too of how are we going to help our children heal? Because this will have, I believe, as yet, an unspoken deep impact on our children, which is why we've come up with the concept of a recovery curriculum. And hopefully you've all had access to the paper that James kindly sent out in advance. And you'll see that the recovery curriculum is not like a politically driven curriculum. There's actually no content to it. The actual content is for you to design. What Matthew and I have tried to articulate is what are the losses, and the 5 losses which I put together, and then what are the 5 levers? How are we going to lever our children back into the situation of being an efficient and effective learner? Because many of them, I believe, will have become disengaged learners during this period of time. And I'll focus more on the concept of engagement later. But just a word on the recovery curriculum as a construct. Construct is part of the word construction. And by even putting this paper into the public domain, it's intended for you to now partner with Matthew and I in the construct we put together, and for your school, in a very personalized way, go through the construction of what a recovery curriculum will look like. I am frankly appalled when people say that children will just hit the ground running and all will be fine and dandy. It will not. We're naive if we believe that. If we believe that Johnny left on page 76 and we return to page 76, then we've really no concept of what Dylan Williams, in his writing about the curriculum, would call the daily lived experience of the child, of the student. You'll see on that second slide that I'm showing, there's now a recoverycurriculum.org. We've developed a community of practice, which is being hosted for us by an organization called Evidence for Learning. My inbox has been overloaded since this has started. I've had invitations to go up and down the country, none of which are possible in the current restrictions. But really, it's about a dialogue starting between schools, a sharing innovative practice of creative ways, bringing out the best in our profession. Most of all, bringing out the relationship dimension to teaching as a profession. So what are the 5 losses? The 5 losses articulated in the paper are really what I've drawn from the writing that I've been able to get access to. Teaching is an evidence-based profession. A lot of our strategies for working with children are rooted in a strong evidence base, maybe even in research. This is totally new. Who would have written about this 12 months ago? We had no idea, no concept. So I would put my hand up and said, this is not strongly evidence-based. However, it is based on a systematic deduction of what's currently being articulated, what's currently being identified as is happening to children. So you have these 5 losses of routine, structure, friendship, opportunity, and freedom. And there are probably others. And yes, you could straight away say, well, these break down into other aspects, and indeed they do. And part of the design of this piece is to make you have debates and conversations with your staff, to begin a dialogue, to agree to disagree, to expand, to contract, whatever suits. It was trying to give us some meat upon which to have those debates within our school context. For many of our children, the very loss of coming to school every day, that routine of getting up, getting your school bag together, heading out for school, that will have had a significant impact on the daily routine of our children and indeed on their families. Whilst I haven't always been explicit in this piece about teacher needs or family needs, I hope you can see through the words that families have lost their routines. Parents have not been going out to work in perhaps the same way. They may have been furloughed, they may have been working from home, they've certainly had to adopt your role, that of being more directly a teacher. For some of our children, that loss of structure, of not knowing what's going to happen to them, for how long are they doing the home tuition, what other things are offered at home. In school, there is a timetable that they follow. They know what's happening now and what's happening next. And indeed, I think one of the major impacts is that loss of friendship, that loss of social interaction. And indeed, that will trigger, I think, some bereavement. And if you've looked at the paper, you'll know that I've suggested that loss has direct links to anxiety, to trauma, and bereavement. I think some of our children will be mourning that loss of routine and structure. They will have realized, whilst they thought it was a very fixed thing in their lives, it actually can be transient. It has a fragility to it that they never realized. And so we're going to have children returning to us, I think, in a bereavement state. And we will need to unpack and explore that. And I will come to that later in the presentation. For many children and young people, I think there's been a loss of opportunity. I'm pleased in many ways that one of the groups being brought back is Year 6, because there is a real rite of passage, is there not, in that transition from primary school to secondary school. The whole transition and transfer process will have been redacted. Children will have not had the opportunities to go on visits to secondary schools in the same way. Will indeed they be allowed to now? Are you going to need your secondary schools to be offering virtual tours of the secondary school to remind children of the layout of settings? Are the Year 7 form tutors going to need to do some video conferencing with your Year 6 students? Again, we're going to have to be very creative about this. I think one of the most poignant phrases I heard was from a young woman who should have been sitting her A-levels, who said, they told me I was preparing to run a marathon. Now they tell me there's not even a race. I think that epitomizes the loss, and there are worries about opportunity. We've got graduates feeling they've graduated, but have they really? Will society devalue their degrees because they graduated in 2020? We've got A-level students, GCSE students who are utterly bewildered that these exams that have been drilled to them for years can be removed at what to them might seem like a whim. We know there's very good reason and rationale behind it. And then there's been a loss of freedom for our children. They have not had the sort of scope, particularly, that they would expect to have in their childhood for being with friends, for exploring life in general. They've literally been locked down in their homes. And really, what child wants to be with their parents 24/7? It's a very uncool thing to have to do. And I think you will find that some of your children have very strong views about the experience that they may feel they've been forced to go through. There's going to be a lot of hidden feelings. It's going to, post-pandemic, I think, take a long time for what I think in the psychological writing is called settle to learn. Settle to learn. Your children will come back with a lot unspoken. They will have gone through maybe some severe stress. Severe stress upsets the nervous system. Many children may be jumpy, volatile, hypervigilant, still operating in survival mode, and they might easily be triggered into flight or fight reactions. Some may be exceptionally quiet, and yet pre the lockdown, they were the chatty child in the class. The child that was always the kind one and nurturing to others may, when you look at them, just about be hanging on to themselves, let alone to others. A trait you may see in girls particularly, because there is gender bias in learning behaviour, might be that some girls might freeze or disassociate. Some of you will know my most recent research and writing has been around girls with autism. And in girls with autism, we call it masking and camouflaging. And I think you will see some of your children, male or female, masking and camouflaging. How are you doing today? Oh, I'm fine, thank you, with a grin that really is a mask. When you check how you're feeling about this, oh, good, thanks. But really, it's a camouflage for the inner turmoil. And it's going to take a lot of sensitive teaching. It's going to take a lot of what we've written in the paper as compassionate leadership. Compassionate leadership breeds compassionate teaching. Compassionate teaching brings about kindness in children. And I think those are treasured values that I hope our profession can espouse in the coming weeks. So let me expand a little bit with some direct quotes from the paper to go with those 5 losses. So on the loss of routine, it's about the loss of structure and coping mechanisms. Children may seem quieter, troubled, easily alarmed. They may lead to panic attacks. They're coming back to school, some of them, at a time when the pandemic continues. There were yesterday still 210 deaths. there are still there are still adults being diagnosed with COVID-19, and indeed they will know too that whilst not many, some children have died of COVID-19. Will children themselves feel, is it safe for me to come back to school? Some will come back to school having been told by the parents, you have to go back to school, I have to go to work. And it's not a decision that either of them are happy with. That loss of structure, children, and this has been said to me by children, feel that they were abandoned. The suddenness of the lockdown, I think, may cause some children to feel now out of control. That you've always encouraged them to think things through, to be logical, but their own intellect no longer informs their personal judgments. A politician in London can have total control over their lives. What does that mean? There are going to be lots of questions asked, and there are going to be lots of questions not asked, for which you may need to guess and construct an answer. I've already touched on that loss of friendship. They will grieve for that period of social interaction with their friends. And indeed, will their friendship groups be the same as the ones that they left? Will they be the person that's alienated for whatever reason? Indeed, have they come back to school and their best friend is one of the children whose parents decided to keep them at home, so they don't have that buddy that they're used to being in the playground with? There's that quote I gave you earlier from the A-level student. Some students, some young people, may actually have care responsibilities in the home. So being at home for them has increased the weight of their responsibility. Maybe they haven't had home tuition for whatever reason, or not much of it. Will they feel that they are academically disadvantaged? Do we need to be explicit with them that those children that have been in school that you've been caring for because they were vulnerable children or the children of key workers have not now progressed several miles ahead of the rest of them in terms of the regular curriculum? Do not assume anything. Let's just talk it through, make it obvious, make clear statements that the children can either absorb or come back to us about. And I know that some children feel that those that have been in school feel that the in-school children have had an advantage. So that whole thing of anxiety, trauma, bereavement are powerful forces. Our children are vulnerable at this time, and in particular, their mental health is fragile. My advice to any school is that the core of the returning curriculum needs to be about emotional well-being. I was talking with a head teacher this morning as part of another interview, and really my gut tells me, based on many years of teaching, that we need to be teaching the academic stuff in short bursts, say 40 minutes of literacy, followed by 10 minutes of exercise, particularly if the weather continues well, another 40 minutes of numeracy, and 10 minutes of exercise and activity again. Not PE, just sometimes plain walking around, or a simple ball game, which we could do at a social distance, whatever. But that exercise is about the release of some of this pent-up emotion, this desperate need to try and make sense of this world that's in turmoil, of this life for them that has lost its structure, its rhythm, and its routine. So loss generates those four consequences: bereavement, attachment, anxiety, and trauma. Attachment I haven't touched on yet, and I want to come to, because I think that has specific connotations. Children attach to their teacher, not in the same way that they attach to their parents, but hopefully there is a good, meaningful relationship between you and the children that you teach. And then, for reasons they know, you were told to close the school, and that had to be obeyed, but they felt somewhat abandoned. We need to reconstruct our relationships, reestablish our relationships, because secure attachment is linked to the learning profile. of our children. When children are securely attached, they're better problem solvers, they're more curious, they achieve more academically. When they're securely attached, they're more self-aware, they're more cooperative, they're more empathetic. And my goodness, we're going to need spade loads of empathy. So that whole thing about attachment is really important. If that's something you're not confident that your staff know much about, or certainly do not understand pedagogical implications of attachment and how it can be a barrier to learning, then you might want to go to the attachment aware school site. I've provided James with a list of what I call useful websites, and that can be circulated to you all, and certainly attachment aware schools is on that list. I want to deal a little bit with anxiety, because these days we know from neuroscience a lot more about anxiety than ever we used to. Let's just think what's happening when the child gets increasingly anxious in your classroom. The cortisol levels in the brain rise and rise, and as they rise, if they hit the surface of the brain, then in fact the cortisol blocks the area of the brain that would imprint, that would store in the memory. So we need to be mindful all the time of how we can lessen anxiety in our classrooms. We need to be looking at the rhythm and routine of our classrooms. And whilst we will be planning to some degree, we need to get back to teacher intuition. Listen to your gut reaction. Differentiation may need to be done on the hoof. In fact, my guess is the majority of differentiation, that process of meeting individual needs in children, will be an on the hoof process. So the anxious child is not a learning child. And the anxious child isn't necessarily a disruptive child, isn't shouting and screaming in your classroom. They could be the child who is sat at the back, very quiet, not said boo to a goose, but in fact they were rigid with fear for whatever reason. Maybe it's fear that the virus is going to come and get them. Maybe it's fear that you're going to ask something of them that because they've been out of school, they might feel ill-equipped to answer. There's a myriad of reasons. We will never know what some of those reasons are. And that's why some of the approaches I'm going to suggest later are based on sound well-being principles, but really are a panacea for trying to meet a spectrum of need that may exist in our children upon their return to school. So to summarize, the recovery curriculum is a construct. And today, through this session, you're being invited to go through the construction of a recovery curriculum that's appropriate and pertinent to your school. And it needs to be built on compassionate leadership. You're also going to have teachers returning to school who are also in a distressed state for whatever reason. Some teachers may have been through direct grief of a relative. How are you going to make some of these judgments? And it's time to go back to those aims and values in your school. What drives your school? And at times, there is no clear evidence in a way that we're used to having in the profession. At times, it is about your best informed judgments. You know the design of your school. You know which areas can be accessible to children safely and which areas may need to be taped off because more than one or two children in that area, it would not be safe. So all the time, it is about a personal response in the context broadly of your school. It's about a personalized response to the learning of your children. It's about a personalized response to your staff, because some of your teachers, for health reasons, may not be able to return to the school much as they would want to. They may want their contribution still valued. So maybe they're the staff that then take charge of the online learning, for example, while others are actually at the coalface with the children. There may need to be a redistribution of responsibilities. These are the 5 levers that are suggested in the paper. The first one is relationships. Absolutely, it is about relationships. Colleagues, can we remind ourselves that teaching is a relationship-based profession. They can throw whatever policy they want at us. They can inspect us within an inch of our lives, but they can never take that away from us. At this time, more than ever, we need to ask ourselves, what is it that called us to be teachers? Because I still, however old school it may sound, am of that firm belief that teaching is a vocation. What is it that called you to be a teacher? What is it in your humanity that has called many of you to serve society's most vulnerable children? And please don't walk away from that question. You have to be able to answer it. You have to answer it within yourself, because otherwise you'll be no good to the children. You won't have the inner strength to meet this vast array of needs, some of which, in all of your wealth of experience, you've never met before. So think about teaching us a relationship-based profession. We've done a great job in looking after each other so far. We need in our school communities to look after each other some more. When I was 5 years Her Majesty's Inspector, and they used to give me, obviously, special needs to inspect because that was my background, but they often used to give me school ethos and some checklist, and I used to look at that checklist and think, I can't do this. Because I'd be 15 minutes in a school and I'd know about the ethos of the school by just everyday indicators. It was about how children spoke to each other on the playground, how children spoke to staff. A good indicator was often how staff spoke to the head teacher. These are our school communities, and they're built on relationships. More than ever, we need to treasure those relationships. We need to rebuild that sense of community. Our communities were broken through no fault of our own. Our communities were shattered. We're coming back very tentatively. We need to engage. We need to listen. We need to understand and grow together. We are teaching children in the coming weeks, the likes of which actually we've never taught before, because we've never taught post-pandemic children before. And they may bring a set of needs that in many ways are similar to what we've experienced in children with trauma or were vulnerable before, but they'll bring new questions that we've never had asked before. So we need to think about the metacognition in all of this and explicitly scaffold the teaching in a very responsive way to grow the confidence. Some children will have lost confidence, and that's where Lever 4 becomes really, really important. This transparent curriculum. Can you talk to your children about what it is they think they need to know? Can we co-construct a curriculum with them? Co-construction is a very important principle in the curriculum currently, about co-construction and co-production. This is a real opportunity. My son had an interview with his student parliament last week, and he asked them, when you come back, what is it you want from us? And a clear response from them, year 7 to year 13, was, we want someone scientifically to explain coronavirus to us. Is that a primary need too? How would we give the children knowledge about the virus? And I'll come to some resources later on. And the fifth lever, I was very keen that we included, we need space. The children need space. Space to be, which might be solitary, just wandering around your school environment, rediscovering who they are within your school. We need lots of activities that build confidence, self-esteem, self-image, and self-concept. So you're going back to school soon. What are the phases of the recovery curriculum going to be? And I would suggest this, that we need something for everyone. You are going to have resilient children in your population. You are going to have those that will bounce back, but let's not assume, because even those that bounce back will have questions, will want the knowledge. And we have to place relationships front and center and build social capital within our school communities. We need to settle our children socially, emotionally, academically, And we need to do that through kindness. We cannot assume these children will be the robust learners that left our schools a couple of months ago. So it's something holistic for everyone. And then we may have focused recovery, which is about more personalized, needs-led stuff that we might do in small groups. We might decide to have a worry tree where children can hang things on the worry tree, and each day you take a small group that deals with the worries that are on that tree. And then there are deep recovery that will not be done this term, which might be done over the next year or more, where for some children, this has been exceptionally traumatic. Those children maybe that have lost a grandparent. We can't have had 30,000 plus deaths, many of which have happened to people in the older age groups, and some of your children not have lost a grandparent or a relative, or their next door neighbor was a nurse who died on the front line. We need to have deep recovery time. And again, I'll address some of that in some of the practical ideas later on. But we need to identify and support those children that are going to be most in need of what one writer has called social buffering. Some of Bruce Perry's work on distress and trauma in childhood is very helpful here, which will keep us thinking about what's happened and keep telling and retelling the event to trusted friends and loved ones. Well, that can be you. It can be you as their teacher. That just one day of explaining coronavirus isn't enough. I'm not suggesting it becomes a main topic of every day. But when a child wants to ask again about it or say, can you explain that again to us? The answer is yes. These coming weeks need to be built on a responsive curriculum. Colleagues, the curriculum is the servant of the child. It is not its master. Has there ever been a time when we need to serve children's needs? And maybe conventional curriculum is for a time abandoned or used only as a structure to help reconstruct the lives of our children within the school community. It's going to be about that skilled, intuitive teacher who can lift the mask of fear, and for some children, disenfranchisement. They may feel alienated by this school that puts them out. We need to engage the child, and for me, the key principle is engagement. Next week, on one of the websites I'll recommend at the end, I will be publishing another paper called The Case for Engagement, where I'm going to take a lot of my research work has been around engagement. And I think engagement is the liberation of intrinsic motivation. There lurks within every child that motivation. But for some of our children now, they will have masked that motivation. They will have hidden it. They'll be frightened to bring it out for fear that they may expose themselves or someone might try to take it away from them again. Is the lens through which we're going to discover about our children really literacy and numeracy? Or are there other ways that we might want to look at our children to discover what's really going on for them? How are we going to talk to them about reaffirming the boundaries, the rules, the routines, and indeed the safety measures that you're going to have to put in place? You introduced some of those before the lockdown. We're going to have to introduce more now. The emphasis on social distancing is going to be much more pronounced, whereas it was probably hand washing and singing happy birthday twice before the children went off. But for you as a staff team, it's about reevaluating and reaffirming those core values that made you the proud and effective schools that you were, and recognizing this at all levels and all aspects. That comes to the fore more than anything. You're going to be teaching to the aims and values of your school, actually not to a structured curriculum, because you will have children who need some form of transformation from the trauma state that they may find themselves in. I want to share with you now some practical resources that may help you on your journey. Can I say that there are a range of books that I've been collecting from as far away as South Australia. Anything anybody's written that's pitched at children that explains the website, which is Barry Carpenter Education, which will be at the end of this PowerPoint, And I know Barbara and James intend for you to have this PowerPoint post this presentation. These are wordless books, and this is completely free by a charity called Books Beyond Words, who produce a whole range of wordless books on emotional topics. Now, straight away, your intuition will be, Barry, we don't want wordless books. We've got very high literacy standards in our schools. Thank you very much. We don't want wordless books. Well, let's just think about what's happening in the brain of the child who's fearful, the child who's anxious, the child who's traumatized. That cortisol will be having a nice rampage through that brain. And the decoding and encoding processes, graphically or phonetically, children are going through, let's say, a grief response. The grief response begins at the back of the brain, and that emotional response has to transverse the brain. If they're traumatized by the virus and are trying to talk to you about that, if you're asking them to read about it, then the read will block the emotional release. What is it that you want at that point? It's not actually about the child's literacy attainment. It's about the child's emotional understanding of this traumatic event. So this book, I'm actually vice chair of the National Charity Books Beyond Words. And this book has come about, I have to say, through the generosity of the Secretary of State. The chair of the group, Baroness Hollins, and I put a bid together. Baroness Hollins, in her bold way, walked into the Secretary of State and left with 10,000, which actually enabled us to produce this booklet and others and to make it available free of charge. Now, all I would ask of you at the moment is download it, please. Have it in your school, have a copy in your school. You do not know in your responsive teaching when that is going to be what helps one of your children understand. One of your children who may be a really successful reader, no problem, but he's so emotionally upset by this event that in fact they just need it in plain pictures. But you see, with that virus book, in the design it is there, can you see I could name that character Zoe, Barbara could call her Ellie, James could call her Susie. Immediately it becomes personalized. We co-construct, we co-produce, we co-create. Can you see there are sound, educational, very valid and reliable principles on which to build. That organization has also produced other books, again, through voluntary contributions we've been able to get. Look, when it's not safe, stay at home. What if there has been a death? Now, that could be for that deep recovery process I talked about. And you may have a mental health lead or a very good teaching assistant who might deal with that. We've all had good days and bad days during lockdown. Let's talk about it. So can you see there is a stimulus there? And some of you are thinking, well, there's adults in those pictures. Yeah, because their parents are adults. Their grandparents are adults. Lots of people around them are adults. We need adults and children of all ages in some of those visual images. Finally, there is an app version and there are also ebooks. So if you wanted this as a whole class activity, you can get ebooks from the organization. Or indeed, if you want to use it for individual interventions, you could have it on an iPad that maybe one of your teaching assistants uses with a student, which may have to be on a daily basis because the trauma is clearly so deep. A resource that's been my absolute favorite for the last 12 months is the bereavement box from Nurture UK. Knowing that I was doing this presentation for you today, I rang the chief executive of Nurture UK yesterday, Kevin Kibble, who I've shared a platform with many times. Kevin tells me they're now producing a version of this without the box, and the cost is greatly reduced. I think now you can get it for about £20, and it has 60 cards in it. This is another box, 60 sensory minutes, but similarly in the bereavement box, you have 60 cards. And can you see all of these individual activity cards? They're absolutely fantastic. I've just been using this 60 sensory minutes on an attachment project in a primary school and a special school where we're looking at children we know have attachment issues, And so we've gone back to our interventions based on sensory approaches. From that, actually, the major discovery that we were 3 weeks away from sealing when the two schools had to close down was, in fact, the key within those sensory approaches is actually imitation. Do you remember Piaget when you trained as a teacher? Imitation is the foundation of all learning. Now, I'm going to speculate now, but I have been around the block a few times. I have led 3 schools. I have trained myriads of teachers in my career. And if I was coming back into one of your classrooms on June the 1st, I would do some of those imitation games we've all used as 5-minute fill-ins because the lesson plan ran out, you know? Let's do Simon Says. Let's make sure that children, if I put my hands in the air, can they all put their hands in the air? And you think, Barry, that's blatantly obvious and far too simple. No, it's not. If you could see me now and I was putting my hands in the air, just visualize that. What's got to happen there to know I've made that action? Your eyes have to look at me. Your eyes have to send those messages along the neural pathways. The neural pathways into the center of the brain then have to be decoded and encoded and sent down the neural pathways in our arms and have to come out with you putting your hands in the air. Imagine that as a British motorway. That's a fairly long journey, and those little red bollards stopping you, going from 3 lanes to 2 lanes, and then 1 lane, and your journey goes no further. A block could happen at any point. You need to do some checking out that your children's brains are still functioning well. And imitation is a great way of doing that. I was talking to a PE teacher the other day because I've had to do a podcast for the Youth Sports Trust, and I'm not a PE specialist. And a piece of useful advice he gave was teach a new sport to the children. Not a sport they already know, but a new sport that demands that they learn something new. Because when we learn a new sport, we often have to imitate our coach or our mentor in that sport. So it brings in that imitation factor. Maybe you're going to have to develop a new sport that you can do socially distanced. Whatever. Think of creative ways that we can bring imitation in. And don't forget that we've got this whole initiative around mental health leads. The previous 2 things I've shown, the bereavement box and the sensory box, are written by the prodigious Tina Ray. She's just written an article that I've shared on my website explaining why the transition toolkit, which is another thing that she's written, is absolutely crucial at this time. And she's given you all the research evidence for that. Again, when I rang Nurture UK, they are doing considerable discounts on the transition toolkit because they know you're all going to need it for use with your year 6s. I would highly recommend it because it's built on nurture principles, on well-being principles. You haven't got time with your year 6s to sort out which child has got which issue. You just need to take the general view that all children will not have come through the last few weeks unscathed. All your year 6s are now having to have a rushed transfer and transition to secondary. And will this better prepare them? The 60 activity cards in that box are just a joy to work with. Whenever I look at something like that, I look at it and think, could I go in a classroom and teach this? And there isn't a card in that transition toolkit that I couldn't teach from. So please do go on Nurture UK and have a look at it. Another cheap and cheerful resource is this one. These are Butterfly Print. They're Manchester based. These are their core booklet, which is mental health standards, which I've used a lot with schools to do mental health audits and find out where we're at as a school. But they then produce these wonderful emotional well-being journals. There's one for Key Stage 1, 2, and 3 and 4. But my advice would be get them all and use them as a resource. Key Stage 3, the design of that one is absolutely perfect for frisky year 6 boys who think they're king of the castle. Some of the activities there are well designed for those boys. So I've been in touch with the producers of these. They are doing free postage and packing. If a parent, so if you've got children remaining at home and you want to provide now some emotional well-being activities for those children who are staying at home and will be utterly miserable that other children have come back to school because they wanted to come back to school. We need now to start to send home learning that is about emotional well-being. These are really very cheap to purchase, and I think it's well worth investing in these. I've used them many, many times, very successfully in lots of schools I've worked with. If you were to analyze the international literature on mental health, you'll have to believe me now, colleagues, but it boils down to two things: what makes us happy and what makes us sad. And as human beings, what we learn is what makes us happy can help us militate against the feelings that are making us sad. You're going to have, frankly, some sad children returning to school. For reasons you may never know, there is just that air of sadness about them. How are you going to help them restore their happiness? Well, I've got one technique that will not cost you a penny. It's no cost, low cost. It's a happiness box. And it goes something like this, because straight away you'll realize this is a shoebox. And I've just been in touch with our chair of governors of our local primary school, and frankly, 180 children in our local primary school, whether they are in school or whether they're at home, will in the coming weeks be making a happiness box. Because the child puts in the happiness box literally what makes them happy. Think of yourself. What would you put in your happiness box? And wine doesn't count. What makes you happy? I've got a piece of music at the moment that I'm playing time and time again, just because I find it soothes my troubled soul. I've got a particular picture of my grandchildren around. If I come back online, you can see me later. You'll probably see that big picture behind me, because having it first and foremost in our lounge, just, I know, always gives me a joy response. And on days which are a bit gloomy, you need that sort of response. So I've been thinking more deeply about the happiness box, and you'll see on that slide there is a link. You can click on that, and I have, with my colleague Bev Cobill, written a rationale. I've given you the evidence base for a happiness box, and Bev has kindly then done a Blue Peter and constructed a happiness box for you and shown you various examples of what you can put in. It can be as age appropriate as you want it to be. Bev has been doing a lot of work with children who've been excluded from school, and she's been using these boxes literally in their home settings and eventually using them as ways of getting a child, a student, back into a school situation. You can imagine that if you give the child a shoebox, or they bring in their shoebox, well, your first art lesson is planned, isn't it? Because it's about designing and decorating the shoebox to turn it into a happiness box. But as I've thought more about this in the current context, I've thought what that child chooses to put in that happiness box suddenly becomes a very simple, crude screening process for you about their emotional state. What if that boy in your class, who's a bold, brassy boy, suddenly puts in a piece of cloth? What's that about? And when you say to the class, okay, you can have 5 minutes for your happiness box, he sits there gently rubbing that cloth. What's the self-soothing that's happening there? Or the child that asks if they can have music in their happiness box, or a book they put in, or a toy they put in. There is a story behind their choice. It will tell you something about their emotional state. But what we need to start to do is use these happiness boxes as intervention. The Royal College of Psychiatrists did a piece of work recently where they said that in the mental health initiatives that are coming down at the moment, schools are absolutely key. Not the psychiatrist's couch, not the psychiatrist's medication. This is about the mental wealth of all of our children. Quite simply, how do we make our children emotionally strong? And to my mind now, particularly when schools reopen, It's about seeing that child who is just sad and despairing. You can feel it, it's palpable. Touching them gently on the shoulder and saying, go and have 5 minutes with your happiness box, which is over in the book corner of the classroom. Or I love the day when the child comes to you and says, can I have my happiness box for 5 minutes? And you don't say no. You're overjoyed that they're recognizing their emotional state and know that by going to use something in their happiness box, they will regulate their emotional state. Some children will come back to you as disengaged learners. How do we engage the disengaged? It's about our relationship curriculum. Now is the time to address that damage of loss and trauma, so it does not rob our children of lifelong opportunities. Let's just check out with all of them that they are okay and fit to be learners again. Let's restore their mental wealth. Let's assure them that, dreadful as this has all been, their aspirations of the future can still be one day a reality. Andy Hargreaves asked in a paper in 2016 about a global epidemic of mental health problems. Well, we have a global epidemic called coronavirus. And at this point in history, we need creativity, care, and compassion on a scale we've never witnessed before. Creativity, care, and compassion. Will those be the hallmarks of our beloved profession in the days ahead, in the weeks that come? The Maori have a wonderful phrase which says, if kindness is shown, then kindness is what you shall receive. And now is the time, whatever age, stage, position you may have, whether it's child, student, teacher, TA, whoever in a school community, the core of our activity needs to be based on kindness. These are contact details for my website, which has got further articles and papers and resources on it. I mentioned engagement. If you go to the Engagement for Learning website, you'll find a very simple engagement profile, if that's something you want to do, which doesn't talk literacy, numeracy, science. It talks curiosity, initiation, investigation, etc., etc. And is allied to, those of you to Senkos or familiar with special needs work, the Rochford Review, that when it comes into legal powers, will bring engagement in a statutory summative assessment to replace the P levels. So in fact, it's a good piece of in situ professional learning for staff that want to use the engagement profile. And finally, there is the recovery curriculum website. I just wish you all the very best in these challenging times, but I also have great faith in our profession that it will be one that demonstrates powerfully creativity, care, and compassion. God bless you all.
Thank you very much, Barry. I have absolutely no apology for overrunning there. That's a fascinating, fabulous mix of research, theory, experience, and some very practical ideas in terms of what we might do next and how we might set up what the challenges will present for us. I've got a few questions, if that's okay for everybody, just as we think about wrapping this session up. One thing that struck me, based on a lot of your experiences, Barry, and many of the things that you said, was that, is there anything that you can do to suggest how we might adapt our focus for recovery on provision for children with specific learning difficulties, perhaps autism, for instance? Do you have any advice as to how we might think about some of those key concepts in a way that most helps those children?
Yes, and I think some of the things that we use for our children are going to be very transferable to the profile of learning some of our children come back to school with. So let's remember, first and foremost, children with autism are visual learners. So go for the visual. So your timetables in the coming weeks may be dramatically different to how they might normally be. Make sure that that is visually presented for the child with autism in your class of whatever age, that in fact it's on a strip on their desk so they can always see it. And I highly commend to you the now next principle, or sometimes it's called a first next principle. Now we're doing literacy, but next we're doing exercise. Now we're doing exercise, but next we're back to class and it's numeracy. Now we're doing numeracy, but next we're going to play ball games, and not give them the whole timetable for the day, you'll have discussed the whole timetable, but in front of them, they have what's now and what's next. So that actually reduces anxiety. Remember too, if those children have behavioral outbursts, our natural inclination is to use our calming voice and talk to them about de-escalating that behavior. The first sense that shuts down when a child with autism goes into a behavioral episode is a sense of hearing. So you must have about your person some cue cards that perhaps you have them on a sort of key fob thing that you can put in front of the child, which directs them perhaps to a chair or to a safe place where they can, with your support, self-regulate their behavior. So I just think the visuals are important. And that would help us too to think about the memory loading on what presenting for our other children too. My point about the wordless books.
Thank you, Barry. A couple of our audience have raised some questions, particularly about Year 6, and I think not so much questions but observations really, I think, based on some of the things that you said, which is that we'll be probably looking at returning Year 6 children into split classes where some of their friendships may be split, and of course trying to give an opportunity for children to mix again but at socially distance does provide another layer of challenge for those children in transition. And I think I don't know if you've got any brief thoughts that you could offer on that response.
If that happens, have we just thought of that old activity of writing a letter to a friend?
Yeah, sure.
It just seems to me that those letters could be left then for when the day their best friend does come to school, and they could write a response. And it would just be a way too of actually expressing the feeling and the emotion and just sharing. It used to be so important, and I think it's one of the things we've lost as a society. Maybe now's the time to find a way of reinventing that. Thank you.
That's very helpful. I think you did touch on this as well in your presentation, but obviously I think that we've got another 3 or so weeks before the 1st of June, and then after that date we will probably still have numbers of children that won't be returning, where some even perhaps members of their family will be. And I love the thought of the butterfly journals. Can you just give us a very quick brief summary of what we might be able to do now remotely to sort of support our families and our children with some of the development issues that you've identified around mental health and mental well-being?
Well, as I said when I talked about the happiness boxes, that if you do decide to do that in school when your children return, then that should be an activity that every child at home does as well. So the sheet that you're going to circulate to people, James, does that step by step how to make a happiness box. So mom, dad, whoever is the home tutor for the child at home can still go through that activity and see the reasons for doing so. So we don't then say some children are getting education in school and some are not. They kind of, that's one activity that's common. But the activities in some of those butterfly print wellbeing journals would be exactly the sort of thing that a teacher then could send home again for those children there. But you would know which ones are best. I love, in the Key Stage 3 one I mentioned, there's a lovely activity called the graffiti wall. And the graffiti wall is nothing different to what a word wall in Key Stage 1, except it sounds a bit cooler to call it graffiti. If I was back in the classroom, I'd have a black wall, black sugar paper up the wall, white chalk wall put in, and then I'd have some coloured chalks. I'd say to the children, right, you can write whatever words you want up there in whatever style of writing you want, provided you can spell them. You know, it's about giving some age-appropriate challenge, but not awfully demanding tasks at times intellectually. It's about helping the child re-engage and rediscover themselves as a learner that they're proud of.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And finally, a question I think that many head teachers and leaders will be thinking quite carefully about. I think one of the greatest challenges that we face in school leadership over the next few weeks is how to be able to respond to fears regarding safety that parents and staff may have, and how particularly we might be able to directly communicate with staff about some of their anxieties and their worries, and have you got any suggestions about how we might think about doing that?
I would have thought there is a need at the end of every school day for a debrief, because who knows what experiences some of our teachers will have gone through in a day. We could not have planned for some of the things that will happen. So to have that time to talk, to reflect, to debrief, and then come up with some creative ideas for the next day. This isn't about long-term planning. This is about having some infrastructure in which we daily infill what the responsive curriculum might be. Let me say that phrase again. The curriculum is the servant of the child. It is not its master.
Thank you, Professor Carpenter. I found that utterly illuminating and incredibly helpful. I'll hand over to Barbara, who I think might just have a few more words before we close.
Yeah, I think the only words that I have are words of thanks, Barry. I am really grateful to you that in all your international invitations and possible expansion, you have been gracious enough to spend time with us. And what you have shared with us has been of such super quality and so helpful and informative, but also affirming. We are a school group which stands on our ethos. Other schools are available. We are here not just because of what we do, but because of who we are. And I think it's really affirming that you've drawn us back to that as being the place where this all starts and goes back to. And, you know, for me, the phrase that would be going up on my wall, if I had one, was your phrase about compassion. Compassionate leadership brings about compassionate teaching, and compassionate teaching brings about kindness in children. I think that just sums up what we want for ourselves and for our colleagues and for our little ones. So thank you so much. And then next week, we are planning a webinar which will be about developing some of these things, but also in the context of the how, not just the what we're going to do when we get the kids back in all together, but dealing with some of those things that have come out late in the evening. What a surprise yesterday, the hows of how we get this together in a very different sort of school situation. So the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon you and keep giving you peace. And the grace of God goes with us. Amen. Amen. Bye, everyone.